So my mother, South African, and Xhosa woman. My father, Swiss, from Switzerland, but was living in South Africa. So those are the parental ingredients. My grandmother, I think, is a key ingredient because I spent a lot of time with her as a young child. My grandfather was a crazy, funny man, was bipolar, but we didn't know at the time. I think we knew towards the end of his life, but it made him wildly entertaining. Yeah, it's an interesting and tough one, because I often think, as much as we're baked to what you're saying, I think that we're baked, but then we are very much a product of the people that we then come into contact with. So I think of most people sort of like a sponge cake. Like most cakes are very basic, most of them. And then what really makes them special is what the baker does to them afterwards. But the fundamental cake is pretty much the same. And I think people are like that. Yeah, there's certain things, like the color of our skin and tone of voice and all of that. But then I think it's everyone we come into contact with that gives us the icing, that gives us the shape, that gives us the dynamic texture that makes us who we are. And so I strangely enough, I feel like it's all of these people that I was lucky enough or unlucky enough to bump into that gave me a little bit of that texture and shape. And I think that's the same for everyone, That's probably why I'm so conscious of choosing my friends, because I think that's me actively choosing the people who are going to keep shaping me as I live my life. First of all, I was born and raised in South Africa, right? I was born in 1984, so that was 6 years before apartheid ended. Born to a black mother and a white father at a time when it was illegal in the country. And it was strangely unique, I guess because it was illegal, So I grew up in a world where I didn't see many people like me who had my background. I saw some people who looked similar to me, but they had a completely different background. South Africa's racial dynamics are very complicated and sometimes throw people off, especially like internationally, But yeah, I think that's one of the, that's the beginning of me. And then I think, I look at these ingredients which aren't necessarily the best in choosing your starting points, but then there was a series of lucky breaks, the dominoes, as you say. There was a series of lucky breaks. So one of those was apartheid ends. So apartheid ends when I'm 6 years old. And I always think to myself about how much that changes my entire life. Because if apartheid, let's say apartheid went for 10 more years, then now I'm 16 and I haven't been able to go to the schools that I went to because, only white kids were allowed to go to them. And children of color, black children in South Africa were restricted from going to the same schools and weren't allowed to live in certain areas. And your whole life was defined by the color of your skin. And so that becomes like one of the first dominoes that I didn't have anything to do with that changes my life. I was lucky in that I think at least on the surface, I didn't feel it. Because one of the most important things I've learned from my upbringing is a child's reality, for the most part, is defined and created by their parents or their caregivers. So I didn't know that my world was strange. I didn't know that my mother wasn't legally allowed to have me. To understand the apartheid system, I always try and break it down for people. People think of like racism and they go like, oh, okay, it's racism. And I'm like, no, it's a much more insidious system that was designed to oppress people based on the color of their skin. So where America just said there's black and whites, and if you had like one drop of blood that was black, you were black, and it was a very simplistic system. The apartheid system was a culmination of all of the worst ideas from around the world in and around race. So the architects of apartheid explored what the Australians did with the Aboriginal people. They explored what the Dutch did. That's where the word apartheid comes from. They looked at what the Germans did, during the rule of the Nazis in Germany, like Nazi Germany. They looked at every type of racism, including in the U.S. It's crazy how much effort they put into doing such a terrible thing. I often joke with my friends and I go, if they put that amount of effort into making a great country, South Africa probably would have been like one of the most powerful countries in the world by now, because there was a lot of effort, and it's a genius system, but just in the wrong direction. So what that meant for me was I could be born by my mother, you know, I could be the seed of my father, but I couldn't live with him. We couldn't live with him. We couldn't live together. He couldn't live in our areas. I could, you know, technically speaking, my mother, my father, and myself weren't allowed to live in the same area. That's how granular the system was. So I was considered superior to my mother, and then my father was considered superior to me. You know, and so when I was really young, for instance, I'm still an indoor kid, and I think a lot of that is because when I was young, when I was with my grandmother, for instance, and my mom was working, my grandma would lock me in the house. I couldn't go outside and play with the other kids. I would escape now and again. She'd always tell me stories about how I would like dig a hole under the gate to go and play with the other kids in the street. But she was terrified, and I thought it was just because she was strict and she loved me, but it was because she was scared the police were going to take me away if they found me running around in Soweto, which was a township where only black people were supposed to be. And so in the apartheid system, this skin color wasn't considered black. Your culture didn't matter. All that mattered was your shade. And that was instrumental in keeping a majority as broken up as possible to ensure that they were oppressing many minorities as opposed to one majority of people. So it's really complicated. I mean, and you know, you've read up on it, but it's an infinitely complex system around a ridiculous idea. No, my mom. So when I go out in public with my mom, she would. I don't even know where she came up with this, but she would act like she was supposed to be with me, but not related to me. You know, so she would dress up as, you know, everyone has different words for these in different countries, but like nanny, maid, domestic worker, and she would just act like she's my caretaker. You know, so it would look like my parents, I guess, have hired her to look after me. And so that's how she'd move seamlessly with me in the streets because nobody would suspect it. Couldn't be with my father at all in public. That was just out of the question. I wouldn't disagree with that. I'm sure his instance was probably harder if he A, remembers it, and then B, is separated from his mother. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm not an expert in the field, but I think your mom holds a very different place in your life as a child. You know, I think we're wired that way. And then I was lucky in that I was seeing my dad. Does that make sense? So being in public with a parent is not really something of consequence if there isn't that in the world, you know? And so when I think of like how we shape realities, I had no other reality to compare it to. So it's not like I was seeing other kids thinking, oh wow, I'm left out. There were many other kids. You know, even when I talk about my story, I always say to people, don't think of this as a unique and special story. It's just that I happen to be in a place where people talk to me about it, but I am but one story of many others. I knew many kids whose dads had been killed by the police or had been arrested by the apartheid police or had left into exile. And so they couldn't be with their dads for other reasons. So in a weird way, I used to think I was like the lucky kid. I knew my dad, you know, my dad loved me and I would see this man, and it was so like the feeling of that, I think at that age maybe wasn't apparent for me. I'm sure I've been more affected by things that happened in my latter years because I was more aware of them. But as a child, I'm just having a good time. I'm spending time with my mom. I'm never not seeing her. And if I'm not with her, I'm with my grandmother, which is, again, normal, you know, in many cultures all over the world. But there was never a moment where I'm separated from this person because of the system. And she was brilliant to figure out how to do that. And so that's why I say I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I think everything affects us and everything can be thought to affect us negatively and positively. And, you know, I've yet to meet a human being who's had a perfect existence. So I'm very careful to then sort of like point to everything as the reason for, because everything is already the reason for. Does that make sense? Yeah, she eventually married. She was never married to my dad. So they couldn't get married because of the laws. And then I think afterwards, my mom was just like, well, we are where we are. And then think there was a seminal moment in their lives, where she became very religious and my dad was not at all. And my mom was like, well, I'm going down a religious path, and so this is my new life, It's tough. It's tough to process because I don't even think I fully know what it means at this age. Like love, violence, domestic abuse. These are things that I don't think anyone fully comprehends. Even when I talk to like therapists about it, it's always like it's a theoretical understanding. It's not a fact.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we think that this and this could be because, and this could cause, and therefore that could be, and we have brilliant minds who think on what this does and how it creates, and but man, I will never take for granted what it was like, for myself and for any other kid who's experienced it, growing up in a home where there's domestic violence. Like it's one of the worst things you experience because you live in a world where your parents are like the president in a weird way. When you're a child, your parents are the most powerful beings you know. In your head, no one is more powerful than them. And if you ever have the terrible fortune of seeing your parents, most times your mother, being in a position where she's being violently harmed, I mean, it rocks your fundamental understanding of what the world is, So for me, I mean, that's something I still deal with in therapy today, because I'm always trying to chip away and trying to understand what is still on me and what is calloused that I don't wish to be, and then what is too soft, or what is like I'm always trying to understand it, because I don't think there's one concrete answer for what the experience does to you. So you see, like my curiosity, my question to you then is like, when you go, you didn't experience it, I go, but what did you experience? And this is the weird thing about the mind, right? Is I find whenever I speak to, like brilliant thinkers and, the therapists and psychologists and all these people, what I find fascinating is how sometimes your traumas or your perception of your traumas is directly proportional to what you lived in your life. So in a weird way, you might have the exact same experience that I have. It's just that mine might have been more physical. Does that make sense?
100%. It's an interpretation, right?
I'm always fascinated by that, like by how I can connect with somebody where in their house it was more about like fighting and bickering and people saying things to each other and shouting, and I didn't grow up in that kind of house. But then I've met people who did, and we seem to be kindred spirits because we've both experienced fundamentally an unsafe household. The feeling of an unsafe household. And I think that's something that many adults are still dealing with or not dealing with. But as a child, I don't think we're sitting there with a little notepad going, well, nothing physical happened here, and that was only words, and this was because of stress, and no, we're just experiencing an unsafe environment. Yeah, on my side, it was the other way around. It's like, I think when I looked at how I saw relationships and love in that way, it was like I never saw it as like a prison, but in a similar way, I think in a way that sort of informed my avoidance. It was more me realizing I don't have an opportunity, or I will never have an opportunity to hurt you if I don't fully give to you. You know what I mean? So it was that's why I say we can be in the same boat, but realize we have different tickets that brought us here. The outcome is the same, but we sort of end up in the same place. And so in my world, I'm without a doubt think that seeing a relationship where somebody was hurt because they allowed somebody into their lives affected my ability to allow people into my life, because I was like, oh, if that happens to me, then what happens? Are you a prisoner? Like, are you subject? And you grow up in a world where people just don't seem to take it seriously. This is still a problem in South Africa till this day. I mean, this is a problem in many countries around the world. I was in where was I recently? I was in Amsterdam recently, and I saw they had this huge campaign around femicide and gender-based violence. And it's a problem all over the world where people sort of don't take it seriously. You know, they call it a crime of passion. You know, a woman goes to the police and says, you know, my husband beat me, and they go like, oh, but what did you do? This is between you and your husband. Go home, sort it out, figure the whole thing out. And I think that definitely left me as a child, even though as a child, looking at the world going like, oh, wow, okay, so the world thinks this is normal. Then, you know, then that means the world won't keep me safe either. Does that make sense? When this happened? Let me think. No, I was closer to my 30s because my younger brother was old enough-ish to drive, but shouldn't have been able to drive. So maybe he was like 40. So yeah, maybe I'm like 24 at the time, somewhere there. What went through my head was I knew exactly who did it. I knew what had happened. Like it's you know, one of the worst things that comes with growing up in a house of domestic abuse and a house where you're dealing with an alcoholic is you become hypersensitive and you become really good at predicting things, you know. So, I mean, my friends know till this day, I'll be the kind of person, I'll tell you when we should leave a party before a fight breaks out. I'm never around for the fight because I can feel it. I can feel energy. I can feel, and not like woo-woo, like, no, I just start noticing people are not having as much fun as they were 20 minutes ago, and a few of the guys are stepping on each other, and the ratio in the room has gotten bad, and the music's not connecting with people. And I'll be like, it's time to leave, you know? And I think that, from what I've understood in therapy and in working with people who do the research around this, is children start to develop an acute sense. It's like a spidey sense. You know, you hear the sound of a car and you know which car is bringing danger to the house. You know, I would know by the sounds of the footsteps whether or not my stepfather was sober or drunk. Just by his footsteps, I knew. By the way he would close or open a door, I would know whether to be on edge or not. And so when I got that call, everything in me let go. Like it was one of the most, still is, it's like a painful memory, you know, is like, the first thought I had was, damn, it happened. I thought it would, but not like this, but it happened. And as I've come to understand it, what happens to a lot of children who are in abusive households is they develop their hypersensitivity as a tool to protect the parent, because they start, in the same way you were saying with your dad, why is he just sitting here? What happens in a household of domestic abuse is a child goes, oh, my parent does not know when danger is impending, and so I then need to be on alert for them. Because if they don't know, then I need to be alert. And if I'm alert, I can keep everybody safe. And so you develop that acute sense. You develop, you know, your nervous system doesn't rest. I would sit in a room and I could feel the people, and I still have that. I now have to practice letting that go. And so part of it is probably why I'm a good comedian, but it's like learning when I want to use it and when I don't. So learning when to ignore it.
Did you have a choice?
Yeah, you do. You definitely do. You know, I think emotions, you don't really have a choice about your emotions most of the time, but you do choose how you react or how it affects you. And so what I'll try and do is genuinely, sometimes I'll be, even in a conversation, I practice it when it's low stakes. I'll be with friends and I can feel the conversation getting heated and I can feel someone's going to say something that'll hurt somebody else. And then what I'll practice doing is just keeping quiet and breathing. Whereas what I used to do was I would jump in immediately. I would interrupt. I'd interrupt, you know, and I'd be like, oh, did you guys see the, and I would diffuse and I'd find a way. And I was very good at it. I still am. But now I'll just breathe and I'll be like, well, let's see where this goes. I know my friends are not going to hit each other, but I now breathe and go like, it's not my job to protect everybody. And so I just try and breathe through the feeling and see how it turns out. Sometimes I even do it as a game to see if I am right, because sometimes you're predicting one of the outcomes and it may not be the outcome, you know, and I then trust that they can also resolve things themselves. And that's probably one of the hardest things is, as a child, because as you said, you're not understanding how your father's a prisoner on this chair getting berated. And I, as a child, am going, I don't understand why my mother doesn't understand the danger. Why doesn't she leave? And why is she even getting into a conversation with this man? He's not sober. Why is this happening? Many children experience this. And then you then go, this person cannot protect themselves, so I have to do it for them. Just disrupt anything. You know, I could disrupt a conversation. I could find a way to you know, sort of like
Distracting.
yeah, you know, like Chris Pratt with those raptors in Jurassic Park. You just find a way to like snap and, you know, just pull attention. Find ways to. It sounds ridiculous, but literally it was me just thinking of ways. You know, do you close a door that then has to be opened that then alerts more people to the presence of somebody, or do you turn the TV up in this way, or do you say something to him so that he, you know, his mood might shift in a certain way? Do you know, all of these things I was thinking of, and this is me thinking of these things at the age of, let's say 9, 10, 11, 12, you know, all the way through. I think my mother's gift and curse has always been the fact that her religion has powered her through. You know, and if you know somebody who's very religious, you'll know that their connection with God and their purpose pushes them through, you know, obstacles that most human beings would never be able to survive. Never, never, never. So there was never like despair on the other side that I could feel from my mom. I never felt like I had to like cheer her up. You know, the house definitely descended into like a doom, and you could feel there was a palpable sense of tension post what had happened.
That day, you presumably rushed to the hospital.
Yeah. It's such a drawn out feeling and moment, because you know, time is weird in that it stands still when you're experiencing the worst of it, and it flies when it's the best of it. And so that moment, even when you say the word, you do find out, or go like, no, what felt like forever was us waiting for the inevitable news that, you know, our mom was dead. Like that seemed like the conclusion. I mean, I've watched movies, you've watched movies, someone gets shot in the head and it's over, you know? So that was that was me grieving. It's a very strange experience to have, because I grieved somebody. I grieved the loss of my mother, but then she didn't die. But I completely grieved her as if she was gone. Like I cried because she was gone. I didn't cry because she was hurt. I was like, it's over. It's finished. Every thought ran through my head. I was like, wow, I'm raising my brothers now. I was like, okay, I guess now I'm the head of the household. It's amazing. Like my brain spun in every day. I was already now thinking 10 years ahead. I was like, oh man, okay, where are we living? What are we doing? How's this going to work? And, you know, where's my little brother? And what do I tell him? And how do I, you know?